Welcome everybody to our Permaculture is Political web series. We're so excited to be here. So much has gone into this beautiful little 3 days that we have here together. Um, and as we start um, on this journey of taking a look at our food system, at how we relate, how we organize through a range of different perspectives and themes, um, we want to acknowledge first and foremost that we're calling in here from a country of a ongoing history of genocide in so-called Australia, and that part of the underpinning drive for this series is to think critically about how we all move forward and how our food system is informed and the changes that we make. So here, calling in from Widjabul Waiable country in the Bundjalung Nation, it's important to acknowledge that we benefit every single day from the ongoing project of colonization here in so-called Australia. This has many different forms and plays out on First Nations people all across the world in many different ways. And for us to imagine what an equitable food system looks like in the future, we must integrate the history of this landscape. And so we acknowledge the pathway to treaty that's currently going on down in Victoria, the efforts that have gone into understanding, developing relationship, and coming up with a meaningful strategy to platform the nations of Victoria towards that treaty. Now, that is but one of the many ways to acknowledge sovereignty and recognize how we move forward together. And we acknowledge that the lands that you may be calling in from across the world may be at various different stages of this recognition. Our pathway forward here at PermaQueer is bound to First Nation sovereignty and uplifting and platforming the knowledge systems that belong to a landscape that we're on. So for here, that is the traditional owners of the Widjabul Waiable region and the knowledge ways of these lands, seas, skies, and waterways. Within this, we acknowledge the many different implications of colonization currently occurring in the world, namely what's currently happening in Palestine at the moment, and recognizing that what we benefit from today, the history of genocide here, is what we're currently witnessing in Gaza and Palestine. So acknowledging our pathway forward is to recognize, uplift, and empower Indigenous communities to be back in custodianship, stewardship, and leadership of their lands. And how we broker relationship and treaty with them is our obligation if we choose to exist upon their lands. We pay our respects to the Widjabul Waiable people, to all the First Nations traditional owners of so-called Australian Torres Strait Islands. We pay our respects to all of the First Nations people in attendance, to all of the First Nations speakers that are coming along to share their knowledge, their wisdom, and their fight for liberation. And we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that we must be mindful as we develop community systems, food systems, relational systems. We must be mindful what is our obligation towards upholding that. So I'll pass over to you now, Toad.
Thank you, Guy. And I think you started to touch on this really beautifully already. There's a quote by Auntie Layla Watson and the Aboriginal activist group of Queensland that says, "Do not come if you want to help, come if your liberation is tied up with mine." And I might be, yeah, not the correct and exact wording of that. But what I'm speaking to in this work here is that we know that most of the world's biodiversity is cared for by First Nations people. We have this understanding that the way forward towards dealing with climate catastrophe is the uplifting and supporting of First Nations people, First Nations sovereignty, and First Nations self-determination. And a lot of that looks like land back. When we talk about global solidarity, we understand that colonization is a many-armed beast that takes its face and shapes in many different countries and many different places, but can also look the same. And the support of First Nations people here means the support of First Nations people everywhere as well. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, always was and always will be First Nations country. Thank you, Guy. Yeah, so this fundraiser, as part of this, all profits that are being raised as a part of the series are going to be distributed between four different organizations. Two First Nations organizations here in so-called Australia, Yerawan, which is focusing on First Nations foodways, and Land Back, which looks at getting land back into First Nations hands. We also have two Palestine food relief organizations that we're donating to. One of them is Dahlia, which looks towards getting supporting Palestinian uh, food sovereignty, as well as helping secure food security there as well as the Gaza Soup Kitchen, which is doing incredible on the ground work. I think at this point we've raised $5,200, which is fantastic, and we still have people buying tickets, and we will be donating that at the end of the series, and we'll have all of our financial transparency, so that you can see that we're actually donating this money at the end of the series. Thank you, Guy.
Awesome. So, who are we for those of you who have just dialed in because you may have seen this on social media or you may have seen some of the many amazing faces on the social media of the speakers that we have. We're PermaQueer. We've partnered with Lush Charity Pot to produce this event to ensure that we're platforming the voices within our regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and permaculture movements, platforming the voices that need to be heard around recognizing how do we properly integrate social justice and environmental justice and political justice into our ways of being and doing. So here at PermaQueer, we run a range of different programs that try and uplift community expressions of this. We've worked across the state of Victoria with localizing food systems and the food hubs across Victoria, 5 different food hubs there. And we run a range of different online series platforming different ways of approaching how we can develop community food systems. I'll pass to you, Toad, to talk a little bit about the history.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. PermaQueer, as kind of this organization that we have today, started from Guy and I both doing a permaculture design course with Deldent Fleming in Naarm, or so-called Melbourne. At the time, we were both kind of bitter, burnt out queer activists or just organizers just doing things in the world. And we came across this thing called permaculture that I'd always thought was kind of hippy-dippy gardening, farming, something about growing tomatoes next to carrots or something like that. But I didn't take too much notice. And it was when we did our permaculture design course and we looked at designing equitable systems, particularly centered around food in a urban space, that we really started to see what this could look like. And then cue the COVID lockdown. And what had happened was COVID lockdown had happened. We were just, despite being quite low income, we managed to secure food security, housing security. We built a community economy around us. We were feeding ourselves and a lot of the kind of wider community through dumpster diving redistribution networks and food distribution points. And a lot of our friends who had previously had quite a lot of financial security and food and housing security suddenly found themselves vulnerable. And we really saw the ways in which permaculture could be applied in our contexts to really look at creating resilient systems that care for community. So we started just teaching online, just really focusing on teaching this like very rough intros to permaculture to queer, First Nations, and other marginalized communities, because another thing that we found is that a lot of the kind of other permaculture spaces were quite exclusive, very stale pale male, very much a demographic that focuses on the 2.4 acres with the 2.5 kids. And that really wasn't for us and for our communities. And then through some bureaucratic witchcraft, Guy secured us a TEDx license, which really kind of platformed us quite largely. And we had our first community responses to climate change TEDx series. And amongst that, we met a man who spoke for us, Tyson Youngporta. And a really big question that he put to us was, are you queers doing permaculture or are you queer in permaculture? And we totally said, we're totally doing that second thing. And that really kind of changed the trajectory of PermaQueer, because then we started really deeply thinking about what is queering as a practice. And while we get onto it in a minute, I don't want to spoil too much. I'll hand back over to you, Guy, too, because we've been speaking for a minute, but it's good to introduce ourselves as who we are.
Thank you, Toad. Uh, Kia ora koutou katoa. Hello, everybody. Ko Guy toku ingoa. My name is Guy. Ko whitirea te maunga, ko whariama te awa, ko Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, me Ngāti Koata, me Ngāti Makunamara toku iwi. I belong to a mountain called Whitirea, which is at the bottom tip of the North Island of Aotearoa. I come from a river called Whariama, which is on the other coast, and I spent my childhood growing up on that river eating the kahawai fish that swim up there during the summer. I belong to three iwi, three tribes, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, and Ngāti Koata, which are all clustered around the bottom tip of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the top tip of the South Island. I contextualize myself within my landscape because it's who I am. It's where I come from. It is the lands, the seas, the skies, and the waterways that I'm beholding to. And it's what gives me meaning in life. I am one part of PermaQueer, and I play a role in climate justice organizing, storytelling across the food system, across our climate system, and across various different arts and culture institutions in Australia, the Pacific, and Aotearoa. I'm deeply passionate about how we tell these stories, about caring for place, caring for each other, and how these are centered in Indigenous ways of being, and how we can reorient how we might treat each other, treat ourselves, and treat the landscape, recognizing that the solution is in our relationship and that it's always up for transformation. And so my role in PermaQueer is recognizing how do we create environments where transformation and relationship can occur. And at PermaQueer, we play around with very different, strange and weird ways to do that. And I'll pass to you, Toad, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Toad. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an Irish English settler who was born in Turtle Island, or so-called North America, in the little panhandle called Florida. Moved here to so-called Australia when I was 10. Very much my work, I'm one of the co-founders of PermaQueer, and really what draws me to this space and to this work is making regenerative design accessible. Often, regenerative design is very much seen as this kind of very niche thing, or this very kind of, I want to I had someone once describe a lot of the regen ag sectors as like the tech bros of the agricultural world, which kind of made me have a bit of a laugh. But really, my focus with Permaculture Australia and with other organizations is how do we make things like permaculture and kind of wider regenerative movements accessible and exciting and relevant to younger people, to queer people, to people who are marginalized, who are actual, when they have these tools and practices, innovate it and push it far more forward than it currently is. So how do we build those kind of equitable bridges between people who are at times gatekeeping that and the people who are actually living it and pushing it forward? So that's what kind of draws me to this work within PermaQueer and how I kind of orientate to everything here today.
And our other member who's been working tirelessly behind the scenes and will also be staying behind the scenes in this is Styx, who is floating around ensuring that all of this stuff is running smoothly and supporting us in this process as well. So if you come along to any of our other programs, you'll meet Styx in that context as well. And that is what makes up the team behind PermaQueer and the team behind Permaculture Is Political. So coming into this space, thinking about the term permaculture is political, arriving here together, actually just existing in the world as it is right now, is challenging. We're experiencing the ramifications of a polycrisis that is spiraling into seemingly more and more wildly dangerous and uncontrollable contexts. And so we acknowledge that coming into these spaces, coming into these discussions, they're not easy. They're not comfortable. And it's important that we come into these spaces so that we can look plainly at what is happening and we can choose to make informed decisions together moving forward. And our work at PermaQueer has recognized that we don't work hard enough to create brave spaces. It's actually a cultural skill that has been removed from society based off of colonization and capitalism. Um, and so this space is intentionally brave, and we agree to come here with intentional bravery. And so, what does that mean? So, the first one is, what is our intention when we come into this environment? For us, that is an intention for transformation. Whatever that looks and feels like for you, is critical for us all to come into this space with bravery. Also, the difference between brave and space and safe. Many of you may have heard of a safe space before, but the reality is, if there is meaningful diversity, so if there are people here that come from a different lived experience to you, exist in society in a different way than you do, we actually have no way of knowing what is safe for you and what is safe for them. So we actually can't assure safety in this space, which is why we don't say safe, we say brave. We agree to come into this environment together. We agree to choose to be brave and be bold and look for transformation in this space. What does that look like? It looks like brave questioning of ourselves when we hear something that maybe we don't know how it's landed in ourselves. Brave questioning of others when we feel something that, hey, maybe that doesn't sit right with me. And also having radical compassion when we hear something that maybe we don't understand, or maybe we wouldn't say, recognizing that everyone is in a different part of this process as we step into bravery and transformation together. And it also looks like radical accountability. So it looks like recognizing that, hey, we've all inherited this system. We've all inherited these ways of being. We're all trying to unpack that. And that's difficult. It feels hard sometimes, but we have to have that accountability to ourselves. Otherwise, we're not going to transform through this together. So that's our approach to our Brave Space Agreement, and this is how we will be holding the next 3 days so that we can lean into the transformation that these amazing speakers will be bringing into the space and that we can platform the amazing knowledge and lived experience that they're bringing to the space and enable it to fill up our cups in a way that's appropriate. I'll pass to you, Toad, for about the encounters in this space.
Thank you, Guy. Yeah, brave space encounters. So I think most people are familiar with that sense of discomfort that can occur when we start talking about big things. When people start naming some of the elephants in the room, like whiteness or misogyny or patriarchy or capitalism or these things, and we have some understanding of it, maybe a deep experience of harm from it, or this deep niggling feeling in us that, oh, maybe I exist within these systems. And we do talk about these. First, to talk about brave spaces versus safe spaces, we have to kind of name these things. We're trying to transform things, and it means bumping up against them. So we do kind of explore these things, and it's really useful that we talk about treating this like a muscle and how we approach this. If we never stretch that muscle of discomfort, it kind of seizes up, and then any kind of movement makes us feel like we're dying, and we experience that fragility. And this can be an act, this can show up as learned helplessness, defensiveness, fragility. I don't want to be here, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, or we can go the other way. And if we push this too far and push ourselves over our own limit and our ability, capacity to navigate this, we can shut down or we can fawn or just fall into a million different responses that are not particularly helpful. So one of the things that we really focus here is really focusing on supporting people's own self-determination. If you find a particular moment that's too challenging, we invite you to kind of step away for a minute, take a break, make a cup of tea. We really forgo the myth of professionalism. I might have a Zoom background at the moment, but I am far from professional in my life, working and otherwise. And also having this idea of what professionalism means, pushing yourself through something. Sit at the comfortable level of stretch that feels good for you, and try to understand, move at the speed of your body and that your nervous system allows you to do, to step into a little bit of a stretch, but not so much that you start to injure yourself.
Thank you, Toad. So here we have built into this series both the listening to all of the speakers that we have here and also mechanisms for us to integrate it into your world and also for you to respond, engage, and interact with what the speakers have said. Um, we recognize that everyone from a community lens, you're an expert in your world, our speakers are an expert in their world, and that also everyone is at a different stop, but we're all on the same train here, trying to move forward and regenerate our landscapes, our gardens, our food systems, and care for one another. So how we've designed this approach at the end of each session, we will have a feedback mechanism where you can interact with other participants of this web series so that you can reflect and you can give your perspectives and you can give any resources or thoughts that you have on this, because as we said, the social ecology is diverse. There are many different lived experiences here, and we want to know, how does this work for you? What does that look like, and how does that actually emerge? And as we're going through this, just a few things around self-care while we're going through this stuff. I'll pass to you, Todd.
Thank you, Guy. As I spoke before about forgoing them with professionalism, we acknowledge the fact that Zoom is a fantastic tool to learn from people all across the world. I'm sure also many of us who experience Zoom fatigue as much of our life migrates into this virtual world. For us, participation, we trust that you're engaging with it and how it works for you. But just a friendly reminder to take little rest breaks, meet your own caring needs, do what you need to do to regulate your nervous system, whether it's moving, it's stimming, whether it's snacking, whether it's drinking lots of water or watching all this lying down. Please meet yourself as you're best able to.
Thank you, Toad.
Hmm.
So, why are we here? What is happening? What are we looking at on the screen? What are we about to go through together? What is this series? And how are we here?
Hmm.
So as we've been saying, PermaQueer is deeply focused on how we meet our communities where they're at, and also how we provide platform and pathway and resource to different ways of approaching things, different ways of operating so that different food systems can emerge. And so in our workings with food hubs, with community gardens, with different to be accessed. A few key themes have come out that are really critical. And mainly, it's recognizing that there are so many different ways that we can approach food sovereignty. There are so many different ways that we can approach relating. There's so many different ways that we can approach how we build community. And the dominant systems that we currently have, the dominant food systems that we have, all skew towards a very, very narrow set of ways of being. And so for us, we find transformation, as we've said, in relationship. And we also find transformation in collaboration. And one of the biggest issues for our movements is that they are very isolated. We have our food movement, we have our climate movement, we have our union movement, we have all these different spaces. Everyone eats under this, everyone relates to the same planet. A lot of people live on the same piece of land, but the ways of being that we currently operate under don't allow this collaboration, don't allow these shared values, don't allow us to have solidarity between these different ways of being. And so we wanted to share how our food system can be a tool for sharing and how different communities approach sharing in their different contexts. And so we've spoken with all of the speakers in the lead up to this about what their intention is in their communities, about what their intentions are for their food systems, and how do we support each other in doing those together. And so we will be exploring a whole range of different approaches to food systems, some of them that might meander a little bit away from the garden and into different systems, um, and then weave that back together to explore what can we do and how can we do this together. I'll pass to you, Toad.
Thank you, Guy. And I think it's also good to talk to the theme of why we've chosen mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms are, very trendy. They're very much seen in all these things, but there's a very particular reason we chose different kinds of mushrooms for the different days of this series. And kind of talking about the ecological functions of mushrooms, which is what we've based the themes of these various days of. And I'll talk about mushrooms more broadly in terms of like regenerative systems thinking and the patterns that they enact in nature. And to do that, I'm going to draw a parallel between human systems and ecology. So I talk a little bit about the function of colonization in human populations. Um, Colonization occurs in terms of people coming into an area where there is quite interdependent, complex living systems, where there is a lot of interdependence between country and people, and it collapses that complexity and it focuses on interchangeability and extraction. And it kind of takes complex systems and simplifies them through theft, through harm, through all of these different things for the extraction of wealth from a landscape. Whereas mushrooms engage in a kind of colonization as well, but in a very, very different way. Mushrooms will come into a lot of like particularly wood rot mushrooms, where like tree will fall and that lignin, that kind of the flesh of a tree or the dead flesh of a tree is not particularly accessible. So it's a very simple kind of system where all of its nutrients are bound up. And what a mushroom will do is it will colonize that substrate or that tree or that lignin. And by the decomposition and the breaking down of it, it's taking a simple system, releasing all those nutrients, and moving towards increasingly complex ecological systems. So we start seeing bugs and birds and all these kind of new life processes emerging. So it's a move from a simple system to a complex system. You can tell that I'm probably quite nerdy about this, and you will see that probably throughout this series as well. But today, we base this concept off of saprotrophic mushrooms or wood rot mushrooms. These are the things you think of, the mushrooms which break things down. They break down the trees that exist in the world and the lignin. And of course, if there's nothing to break lignin down, that's where we get a lot of our oil deposits from historically. So this idea of how do we break down the things that no longer serve us? How do we have honest critiques and honest conversations about the things, these structures that at times crowd us out and at times drown us out or keep us down? How do we look at breaking these things down and moving towards more complex, kind and relational ways of being? And then we have Saturday. We're talking about parasitic mushrooms. And big ecology nerd here, parasites get a really bad rap, in my opinion. So parasitic mushrooms are pretty incredible. Anytime that a branch will come off a tree and there's that little wound there. Sometimes parasitic mushrooms will land in there and they'll carve out a little niche. And by doing that, they create habitat for other animals. So this idea of how do we divest from systems of power and how do we create little niches, little microclimates, little habitat for us to exist in this world as we slowly move towards regenerative ways of being. And on that last day, on the Sunday, we have mycorrhizal mushrooms, which is and this kind of idea of distributing power. And this is where we have that kind of concept of how the trees talk to each other. How do we move between these systems, these big, heavy, siloed systems in the world? How do we become queer and fungal and move knowledge and resources to different people to where it needs to go in really regenerative and just ways of being? And I'll pass back to you after my little mushroom ramble.
Thank you, Toad. So we're going to be exploring a whole range of different approaches to what Toad has just said. So day one, today we have our saprotropic decomposing power. So we've got a whole range of speakers talking about how power exists in our current food system and how we break that down and how we can look at what are the building blocks of it. How have these, structures built themselves and how do they shade out different species? How do they, have really negative impacts on how our social ecology and how our food systems operate? And so decomposing power obviously starts with us opening foundations of transformation. So we're just setting the scene for how we're going to be exploring the next few days together. And we're going to be talking about how you can interact with it as we already have. Our next speaker, Jessica Hutchings, who will come up after us on the hour, who's an incredible Te Mahi Marahura Parakore, which is a Māori Indigenous organics food framework. We'll be talking about how how we seed hope through composting capitalism. So what does that look like from an Indigenous perspective? How is that explored and what does that look like in action? And then after that, we'll have a moment to reflect on what does that look like for you? How do you integrate that and how does that exist in your context? From there, we'll go and hear from Rasha Tayer, who is an incredible Palestinian artist and food advocate and is sharing some of their artwork on compost and composition, composing, and how we relate to food, how we relate to the structures of food, to the access of food, what that looks like in the context of Palestine, how food is used and is currently being used to enact the genocide that we're seeing, and a few ways that we can think about it in our context. As we said, we're witnessing a genocide happen live, and we're also benefiting from one that is ongoing and happened at the beginning in the formation of so-called Australia. And so there's ways that this is relevant here and now, and we will reflect on what does it actually look like and how can we find transformation within this. Then to close off our day one, we have Deepa Jayapalan, who is an incredible food systems coordinator, organizer, and we had the privilege to work alongside for 3 years in Victoria with Vic Health, the state health authority, on localizing food systems. So we work with multicultural communities and youth communities from all across the state on how do we foster their sovereign food systems that are run by them, supported by them, and also what is their relationship to the land that they're on, to the mob whose traditional custodianship should be upheld. So we've got a beautiful day today kicking us off. And then we will move forward on Saturday to day number 2, which I'll pass to you, Toad, if you want to talk.
Thank you. So starting off tomorrow, which is our Parasitic Divesting Power Day, starting off the session, we have Tammy Jonas, current president of Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, talking about agroecology without food sovereignty is just technology. So the politics, the social organizing, the ways of being around movements like agroecology. Then we have Zena Cumston, incredible First Nations woman who does incredible work around culture, talking about death by inclusion. What does it mean to actually weave First Nations people into our work in ways that don't endlessly extract? How do we become reciprocal? And how do we uplift and support First Nation sovereignty, First Nation self-determination in ways that are not extractive? Oh, you're just going to forward a slide there. Thank you, Guy. Thirdly, then we have Starhawk, incredible community organizer, author of many books, talking about regenerative responses to the current situations in the US and Palestine. How can permaculture be used to organize in regenerative and sustainable ways? How do we get everyone along with us in this work of change making? Then we have a short lunch, and then we have Tyson Yungaporta, incredible First Nation speaker, talking about land, economy, and culture as systems as signals. So very much talking about his intersection between systems thinking and First Nations thinking and how that all kind of weaves in together. Then we have Tola Gamai Ai from Pacific Climate Warriors talking about nourishing climate justice in the Pacific, how the Pacific has been leading huge kind of world leading in terms of climate action is being led in the Pacific and what it looks like from a Pacific youth perspective. Then we have Lani Purawa, incredible speaker, talking about Rangatari Māori-led kai and housing. So First Nations-led food and housing and kind of the frameworks that exist within those spaces in Aotearoa or so-called New Zealand. And then closing the session, we have Aoife Hammond from Queer Shed over in Ireland, talking about organizing queer community foodways in rural Ireland. So very exciting day.
And then our last day, closing us off on Sunday, we'll be exploring the mycorrhizal mushroom distributing power, how we've explored, how we decompose these structures, how we take away from these structures and move energy, effort, food, care, community into different spaces, and then also distributing power. Where does it go? What should we do? How are people leading? This change and what does it look like? And that's throughout the whole series. But this theme is really focused on, okay, now that we've pulled it in, where should we push all this energy? As I'm sure you understand with everything going on in the world right now, we really want to be moving in a better direction. And so what are the direction that these people are going in? So we have Keitha Young, who is an incredible seed sovereignty advocate, who's talking about seed stories and how we bring culture into agriculture rather than food, and how we expand on what food, nutrition, story, and culture is in that context. Then at 12 o'clock, we'll be talking treaty. So, what does it mean to be a good treaty partner as the pathway to treaty is entered into Parliament in Victoria, and the national campaign to push for treaties in different states and nationally? What does that even mean? What does that look like? So, we're going to explore the current update of what is happening, and we're also going to look at what does that look like in different contexts. We'll look at treaty in Aotearoa in New Zealand and explore what does that mean for us. Then we have Maya Redmond from Perma Youth talking about the art of societal foraging and how we can navigate our way through the social ecology and how food underpins that. Then we have Ethan Gordon, who is talking about regenerating agriculture with relational values, who's an incredible food system operator in Australia. Following that, we have Fareed Tamala, who is going to be calling in from Palestine to talk about Bali, who is a Palestinian food god, and how they relate through their folkloric traditions in Palestine, and to share the beauty of what Palestinian culture is. Then we have Manu Prigioni, who is talking about recombining permaculture design and enacting and embodying an ethic of care. Manu is the coordinator of Farm It Forward and runs helps coordinate a whole series of accessible farming structures where people can access land that they don't own and set up food system mechanisms, and is incredibly amazing in the work they do. And then calling in from over in the UK and Europe, we have James Atherton and Libby McNamara talking about emerging, resilient, powerful cultures and how they do that over in the US around the rewilding movement, around the permaculture movement, and the agroecology movement as well. And so I imagine we'll all be very, very full, very, very inspired, and having a very, very good time by when that rolls around. And as we continue to layer on a few ways of framing ourselves in this, we're just going to talk about the queer part of PermaQueer, how we approach queering as a design tool, as we understand permaculture as a design methodology. And for us at PermaQueer, we apply queer theory to our permaculture design to enact it as an ecological design methodology. So I'll pass to you, Toad, if you want to elaborate on what that means.
Thank you. Usually when I talk about queer in permaculture or queer theory, something I've had repeatedly again is why you're trying to make gardening gay. Once again, that's always something that makes me have a bit of a giggle. But very much we talk about queering as a practice, and it can seem really nebulous because queering is a very hard thing to pin down or define by its definition. Queer is that which is queer theory emerged out of LGBT plus studies in the same way that feminism emerged out of women's studies. And one of the difficulties of the academicizing of queer theory is the way in which what is queer now may not be queer in the future as like a liminal practice that looks towards the unlikely spaces and relationships that emerge amongst communities, and then how that translates into queer ecology. So very much it's looking towards breaking those binaries of from this to that, when two edges touch, or two communities touch, or two ecosystems touch. Those third, fourth, fifth ways of being, that those cultures or those the biodiversity that emerges when edges touch. And we talk about edge in permaculture quite a lot. We talk about use the edge and value the marginal. We talk about integrate rather than segregate. I think, I can't remember, it's not one of the official ones, but I hear people say a lot, the edge is where it's at. Because it's the edge of a system which has the most contact with the other and the most capacity to change. Once again, this can be very all theoretical and exciting, but doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't ground it in something very real. So we have a definition here by Hannah Breckbill. To queer something is to question norms and assumptions about it, and then build relationships and systems to meet our needs better. Um, Very much this is how we apply our permaculture. To give a kind of a real world example that talks about queering as a practice that's not necessarily focused just on LGBT plus people. I often use the examples of autism coaches as someone who is autistic myself and went through schooling as someone with autism. Very much kids with autism are deemed to be disruptive or unruly or difficult to manage. And there's very much an assimilation narrative, very much with schools typically bring in autism coaches. Uh, there's this kind of thing of like, oh, well, we'll bring them in the right way, we'll straighten them out kind of approach. And many people from different lived experiences, I'm sure, can resonate with that sentiment. But what autism coaches do is they don't change the content being taught. They might change seating plans, lighting, some of the sensory environments. And unsurprisingly, the kids with autism do better. But what's more surprising to people is the kids without autism do better, and the wellness markers amongst the teachers improve. Because the kids with autism were the canaries in the coal mine for a system that was failing everyone. When we design for those on the edge, we're designing for those in the center. Now, of course, we put this to an ecological metaphor. If I'm growing my veggies and I'm happy and feeling delightful and delicious, and I notice that all the birds eating my fruit and veggies are dropping dead, I wouldn't just think, oh, that's a bird problem. That's not a me problem. I would start to sweat. When we think about how the relationships interact between everything, not just the things that impact us, but impact everything within the system, we're looking towards, like from a systems thinking perspective, designing and focusing on relationships between things as much as the individual elements or the individual pieces within a system. Is there anything you wanted to throw in that pot, Guy? Because I can literally talk about querying for hours.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm just gonna flag. We've just had a message from some people trying to get in. They're having access issues. So if you can just jump on that, thank you, Toad. Um, yeah, I mean, querying for us is recognizing that ecological diversity is important, and people have connotations of what queer might mean. We couldn't even begin to define what queer is. It continues to change and develop and grow as the world around us does as well. But what we recognize is the current systems that we exist within, these monocultural, monocropping approaches that try to reduce complexity down to something that's easier to extract from. That is a poor design approach from an ecosystem perspective, and that you will have ecological collapse. And that is what we are seeing in the world right now. And so, how we open up our understanding of diverse ways of being, of diverse approaches to existing, is underpinning how we approach relating to each other. And I'll close that on querying for now, and we will be weaving a few more threads into that as we continue through with some of the other speakers. Um, but I do want to reflect on a few things. So after each session, a link will be put into the chat and sent out to you, where we would love for you to reflect on the session with your whatever's at the top of your head. It doesn't have to be formed, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be, you know, polished. what is landing for you and what isn't. As we said, relationship is really critical to us, and so how we form understanding and relationship based off of what people share throughout this webinar is of deep interest to us, and it is a very generative space. So we'll put that in and have an opportunity for you to share and feedback, and also apply it to your context, um, and so that we don't just sit here as passive receivers of this, but we actually get to participate and imagine in what does this look like in our context and engage that network of incredible participants and attendees that have come along to this session. And lastly, as well, this is a fundraiser. This is so that we can send tangible structural support to a whole range of incredible initiatives. So at the end of each session as well, we're going to put up a little place for you to, if you want to, add a few dollars. I know some people have paid it forward and maybe you've got tickets to come along to this. And we're also just offering up an opportunity that if this was of more value to you than what that was, to add a practice of reciprocity into that, all towards this a really, really important cause right now. Groovy. So, what we're going to do is just warm up the Q&A function, because that is one way that you can interact and will interact with all of the speakers. So I would love if people could jump into the Q&A function and prove to me that it is working. Oh, there we go, one already. Thank you already. Well, thank you very much, Erin. That's fantastic. Yeah, even if it's not a question, please feel free to, as things come up through when speakers are talking, to put it into that Q&A function, and we will respond to that as it comes up. So I'll just give it a moment if anyone has any questions or anything to say. It does not necessarily have to be in a question form. Thank you, appreciate that. That's nice of people. Hi from Tolmer, lands of Yakura, Jagara, and Ugarable people. Hello, hello. Where did you both do the permaculture design course? We did our permaculture design course in Naarm and at Delden Permaculture. Actually, they may have changed the name of that. It was Blackburn Permaculture. Anyway, we can put that into the Padlet as you take a look. But Delden Fleming is an incredible permaculture educator. We've got Ty and Tallulah calling in from Pantua in the Central Desert. Awesome. We've got Luke Charita coming in from Moinia country. Amazing from Jaja. And you can't see the questions on the panelists. Oh, okay. Right, how do we get you to see that? We'll do it.
Maybe just talking a little bit about permaculture education, because that's a really juicy conversation. There's many different ways to learn permaculture. Some are online, some of that's the only ways accessible to us. And there's some great teachers out there like Maura Gamble, who teaches online. But I always try to, as best as I'm able to, encourage people to seek out permaculture education in person. And with that, always keeping a little bit of a hat on our heads. Part of the whole permaculture design framework is that anyone can teach one. And that means that there's lots of incredible PDCs out there. And there's a lot of very wealthy white landowners charging you $6,000 on how to take a swale. So do a little bit of research first before on any of your teachers before you sign up. Otherwise, there are Cert 4s and Cert 5s available, Cert 3s and Cert 4s available. But I definitely encourage reach around and see what's happening in your bioregion, who's doing what, make those connections, and be as local as you can about it.
And also, you know, one of the things that we'll reflect on a lot throughout the series is that there are many different ways that we can understand how to relate to food systems and to our landscapes, and that a PDC is a really amazing approach to do that, and it should also work in concert with the many different other ways of relating to land that there are. And this is what has really underpinned and driven this series, is that sometimes in the permaculture movement, it becomes a permaculture lifestyle, and that is it. Permaculture is a methodology, it's a tool, and there are many different tools. And if we hold on to one hammer and we're just hitting everything with a hammer, not, and it's a very effective hammer, not gonna lie, very good, but there are also many other tools that we need to become aware of and integrate with, because there are limitations to how permaculture operates. Permaculture in so-called Australia looks very, very different to permaculture in Costa Rica, in Timor-Leste, permaculture in the global south, where the cultural context is not constraining how the design methodology is applied, looks wildly different. And there's huge amounts of learning that we can get from how come different areas that have different social constructs can seem to expand upon this more than we can. What can we learn from that? Looking at that as feedback rather than rejecting it. And that is the biggest issue for us here in the global north. How do we navigate what that reality is, and how do we learn from different ways of approaching? So that's not at all to put down permaculture. It's an amazing design methodology. It's incredibly powerful, and it should also be one of the many different colors that we paint our lives with.